Welcome to tonight's broadcast, a special event on cerebralfaith.blogspot.com and YouTube. My name is Evan Minton. I am a Christian apologist and I am a blogger. Tonight, we will be talking about what I think is one of the most powerful evidence for God's existence, the Kalam Cosmological Argument. First, let me tell you a little bit about what I do. Cerebral Faith is a blog that I created back in 2012. The first post I ever wrote was about the resurrection of Jesus, and it was very poorly written because I was just getting started. But the purpose of my blog is to give good reasons for thinking that the Christian faith is true. I write articles about arguments for God's existence, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection from the dead. I address common criticisms that are brought up against the Christian faith from skeptics, atheists. I address arguments against the Christian faith like the problem of evil and suffering, the hiddenness of God. I address alleged contradictions that people think they found in the scriptures. The slogan of my blog is using the brains that God gave us, because I believe that you can be a rational Christian. You can believe because you use the brain that God gave you, not because you didn't use the brain that God gave you, or in spite of it. You're a Christian in spite of reason or against reason. A lot of people categorize faith as believing something for no reason whatsoever. You just believe that it's true, like children believe in the tooth fairy or Santa Claus. Or worse yet, some skeptics they define faith as believing something against evidence or against reason, even though the evidence is overwhelmingly against the Christian faith. You just believe it anyway. I don't believe that that is a very accurate definition of faith. I think the Bible defines faith as something very, very different than what many American churches and many American atheists define it as. So if you want to go into some of the topics that we're going to be talking about tonight further, you can go to Cerebral Faith and scan the articles that I wrote. If you have any questions about God's existence, if you have any questions about why does God allow suffering, or did Jesus rise from the dead, or if you're a Christian and you have some theological question about how what a Christian should do in their daily life, I have a section about that as well called Christian Life Issues, where I talk about things like should Christians marry non-Christians? Is God okay with people playing video games and stuff like that? Tonight I will be talking about the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The Kalam Cosmological Argument was formulated by early Christian thinkers in response to the ancient Greeks, who believed that the universe had always existed. The universe had existed from eternity past. It never had a beginning. The universe was a static, unchanging entity. Christian thinkers realized that this contradicted the Bible's claim about the universe, that it had a beginning and was in fact created by God. So these Christian thinkers formulated an argument for the beginning of the universe and also for the universe's cause. When Islam swept over Europe, many Muslim thinkers also adopted this argument, and they used it themselves, because Muslims likewise believe in creation out of nothing. They believe in a supreme being that created the entire universe out of nothing. And so this argument was very appealing to them. One of its most popular defenders at that time was a Muslim theologian named Al-Ghazali. Modern defenders of this argument would include people like William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig really breathed new life into this argument, and in fact, Craig was the person that I first heard about this argument from. Now, the Kalam Cosmological Argument consists of 3 simple steps. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. Let's go over those again. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This is a logically valid argument. The conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic. In order to reach the conclusion, all that needs to be done is to affirm the truth of both of the premises. And we know the argument is logically valid because it takes the form modus ponens. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. So this is a logically valid argument. The conclusion follows from its premises, and all we have to do in order to affirm the premises is to, all we have to do in order to affirm the conclusion is to show that both of those premises are true. Once we do that, once we show that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and that the universe began to exist, which means the universe has a cause, we can then do a conceptual analysis for what it means to be a cause of the universe. That is to say, what properties would the universe's cause have? So, what are the reasons for thinking that both of those premises are true? Let's start with the first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. I think that this premise is undeniably true. In fact, I don't even think that any defense needs to be given for it. It's just so obvious that anything that comes into being, there had to exist something that before it that brought it into being. In order to deny this premise is to say that things can just pop into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Surely that is impossible. Think about it. Does anyone really believe that things can just pop into being out of nothing? Just pop, 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 with no cause whatsoever? This is absurd. As Dr. William Lane Craig, a Christian philosopher, likes to put it when he defends the Kalam argument, he says, to believe that something can come into being out of absolutely nothing without a cause is worse than magic. He says that at least when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. That's the cause of the rabbits coming into being, is the magician and the hat. But if you deny this premise, then then what you're saying is that things can just simply appear out of thin air with no antecedent cause whatsoever. And that surely seems impossible to me. Secondly, if something could come into being out of nothing, if that is possible, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't pop into being uncaused. Think about it. Why don't we see things popping into being more without cause more often? Why is it that whenever I walk my dog every day, I have never once seen a tiger just materialize out of thin air and chase me down the street? Why is it that I've never, when driving down the road, see a house pop into being right there in the middle of the highway and cause me to swerve in order to avoid hitting it? Why don't we hear people report of mattresses, bicycles, Beethoven, Dr. Pepper, laptop computers just popping into being right in front of them? If this premise is false, if things can pop into being out of nothing, it's just absolutely inexplicable why we don't see this happening ever. Thirdly, I think this premise is true because common experience and scientific evidence confirms its truth. Whenever we see something come into being, whenever we do watch it come into being, we always see a person or something bringing it into being. If you were to see a laptop coming into being, you would see manufacturers putting it together. If you were to watch a house come into being, you would see construction workers working on it. Common experience tells us that anything that comes into being has a cause. Moreover, we don't have any examples of this premise being falsified. I can't think of a single thing that I've ever seen come into being that hasn't had some kind of cause. So the third reason to believe that this first premise is true is because it is constantly verified and never falsified. So we have very good inductive grounds for affirming that this premise is true. Fourthly, I would say to any atheist who wants to deny this premise that he needs to tread very carefully. For if he were to consistently deny this premise, and in fact, if people were to consistently deny this premise throughout history, then science would be destroyed. We would never be able to make any scientific progress. Scientists come to conclusions, they formulate theories, and they discover things about the natural world because they have a presupposition that any phenomenon they're observing has something that caused it to happen. Isaac Newton, for example, when the apple fell on his head, he's concluded, I wonder why apples fall. Why do things fall to the ground when they're not supported by any object? And that's how he came up with gravity. Likewise, we know how lightning and thunder, we know how the weather works because we assume that the reason that storm clouds form, why lightning strikes happen, why rain falls to the ground, is that there's stuff happening up there that causes the weather to change. So science has progressed throughout the last few centuries because we believe that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Temporal events have causes. In fact, if someone were to knock on that door right now, which I hope they don't because I'm doing a podcast and that would not be very good. But if someone were to knock at that door, I would just presuppose that somebody is causing the knocking sound. Someone's at the door. That isn't just happening inexplicably. So I think we have very, very good grounds for affirming that this premise is true. However, some atheists try to argue that physics renders this premise invalid, that there is an exception to this rule. They appeal to the quantum vacuum, and they say that in the quantum vacuum, certain subatomic particles can pop into being out of nothing very momentarily, and then they go back into the vacuum. So it is said that, okay, quantum mechanics is the exception to the rule. There ain't no free lunch. Things can pop into being out of nothing, at least on the quantum level. And the universe used to be, before it began to exist, which is the evidence we'll look at next, it was very, very small, in fact, even smaller than some subatomic particles. So maybe the universe is an effect of quantum tunneling. If you've ever debated an atheist, I'm sure you've heard this a few times. So does this render the first premise invalid? Is there an exception to the rule? Could the origin of the universe be the exception to the rule according to quantum mechanics? I don't think so. You see, the quantum vacuum is not what most people mean whenever they use the term vacuum. When lay people use the term vacuum, they mean nothing. But that is not what the physicist means when he uses the term quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum isn't what most people think by vacuum. It's not nothingness. Rather, the quantum vacuum is a sea of roaring, violent, fluctuating energy. It is governed by physical laws, and it has a physical structure. That is not nothing. Nothingness is the absence of being whatsoever. It is literally no thing. So the quantum vacuum is not no thing, it is something. Namely, it is a sea of roaring, violent, fluctuating energy. It is governed by physical laws, and it has a physical structure. So, and the particles that come out of the quantum vacuum don't come into being out of nothingness. Rather, they are a result of this fluctuating energy. Also, it is very fallacious to try to appeal to the quantum vacuum to try to explain the origin of the universe, because if the universe really did come into being, if that second premise that we're about to look at is true, if the universe came into being, then whatever is a part of the universe also came into being. This would include things like gravity, atoms, matter, energy, space, time, everything that we see that exists. So that the quantum vacuum, you see, is part of the universe. So if the universe came into being, then the quantum vacuum came into being. And so you have to explain how the quantum vacuum came into being also. Okay, let's move on. I think we have very good grounds for affirming that first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Well, what about the second premise, that the universe began to exist? Is that premise true or is it false? Well, let's look at it. I actually have 4 different categories of arguments to show that the universe did in fact begin to exist. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. His equations predicted a universe that was either constantly expanding or else contracting. Einstein was very disturbed by the implications of his theory, so he adjusted his theory by adding in what has been called a fudge factor, a cosmological constant, which would allow the universe to walk a tightrope between expansion and contraction. But this model, this universe that Einstein envisioned was incredibly unstable. The transportation of matter from one part of the universe to the other would upset the balance and cause the universe to either expand or else to contract. Einstein later adjusted his theory to allow for an expanding universe, and he called his fudge factor the greatest blunder of his scientific career. Then, during the 1920s, the Russian mathematicians Alexander Friedmann and the Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre, by taking Einstein's equations, they were able to craft, apart from each other, the models of the universe which predicted an expanding universe. And then, sometime after that, in 1929, Edwin Hubble looked through his telescope and he looked at the sky. And when he did that, he noticed that that there was a red shift in the galaxies, which indicated that the galaxies were moving away from one another. He concluded that the galaxies were moving away from one another on the basis of the Doppler effect. The Doppler effect is when an object's light or sound, when it's farther away from you, the light waves or sound waves are stretched. They are further apart as they are traveling from its object to you. But when it's closer together, the light or the sound waves are much closer together. So the Doppler effect is seen in everyday life. If you were to stand on the side of the road and an ambulance were to be driving toward you, as the ambulance gets closer and closer to you, the ambulance would get louder and louder and louder as it approaches you. Because that's because the sound waves get closer and closer together. The closer the object emitting the sound or the light is to the observer. But once the ambulance is moving away from you, then the sound waves become stretched, and that results in the ambulance's sound growing dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. The pitch in the frequencies go down. So as the ambulance approaches you, the sound waves grow shorter and shorter, which means the sound gets louder and louder. But once the ambulance passes you, the sound waves from the sirens they start stretching in their wavelengths once again, resulting in a quieter and quieter sound. This happens with sound and it happens with light. So on the basis of the Doppler effect, Edwin Hubble concluded that the galaxies were actually moving away from one another and from Earth, and that's why their light was more stretched than it was supposed to be. So what this means is that we have very good theoretical evidence. We had very good theoretical evidence for the Big Bang starting in 1915 with Albert Einstein's equations, and we had 2 more models that predicted an expanding universe. And then in 1929, we finally had we finally had empirical evidence which confirmed the predictions of these equations from these scientists. Now, this was a very startling discovery, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if the universe is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as it gets older and older and older and older, then that means that it must have been smaller and smaller and smaller in the past. It was smaller and smaller and smaller as it was younger and younger and younger. Which this means that the universe, when you rewind the clock of the expansion, the universe gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it reaches a point of infinite density, which marks the beginning of the universe. A good way to think of this is think of a video of a firework display. As the film runs forward, the firework explodes, and you see it go outward. But if you rewind it, the firework implodes on itself and it goes down. So that's the same way with the expansion of the universe. As it gets bigger and bigger, it gets bigger and bigger as it gets older and older. But if you rewind the clock, you find that the universe gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it reaches a point of infinite density, which marks the origin of the universe. This conclusion has been dubbed the Big Bang. It was named the Big Bang as a derisive term by Fred Hoyle. He was making fun of the theory, and he called it the Big Bang theory. There's other evidence for the Big Bang theory besides the expansion of the universe, like the abundance of light elements in the universe, the cosmic microwave background radiation, and others. But for the sake of brevity, I won't get into those tonight. There is another scientific confirmation, apart from all of the evidence for the Big Bang, and that is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, according to it, processes taking place in a closed system always tend toward a state of disorder or equilibrium. The second law brings things from disorder, from order to disorder, disequilibrium to equilibrium. And it also transfers heat from hot bodies to cold bodies. This is how the ceramic heater in my bedrooms keeps my entire room warm at night in the winter. The second law causes the heat not to stay confined to one corner of the room, the corner with the ceramic heater. The second law of thermodynamics causes the heat to expand outward and spread throughout the entire room, keeping the entire room warm. If you were to inject a bottle with gas, and you were to put a lid on the bottle, it's highly improbable that all of the molecules would stay bunched together in one corner of the bottle, since there are far more ways in which the gas can be disordered than ordered, and so it will spread all throughout the bottle. That's what the second law of thermodynamics does. The second law of thermodynamics predicts that the universe has a beginning. You see, since the whole universe is a gigantic closed system, since it is everything that there is, and no energy is being fed into it from the outside, the second law seems to imply that given enough time, the universe will reach a state of thermodynamic equilibrium, known as the heat death of the universe. You see, as the universe gets older and older, more and more of its energy is being used up. Stars are burning their energy. It is converting hydrogen into helium all the time. Everywhere in the universe, energy is being used up. And according to the first law of thermodynamics, the universe only has a finite amount of this energy. Now, you see, if the universe is running out of usable energy as time goes forward, and if there's only a finite amount of energy, if the second premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument is false, if the universe has always existed, then we should have run out of usable energy by now. all of the stars should have burned out and gone supernova, or turned into red giants or white dwarfs, depending on what star it is. And as a result, the universe should not have any life in it, since life requires energy. I mean, even swiveling around in my chair right now is using energy. If the universe has no energy, life can't exist. Your digestive system works on the second law. We depend on this every day by day. That's why the universe would not contain any life as soon as all the energy runs out. But see, if it's existed forever, the universe has always been here, then it has always been chugging away its energy. And so it should have run out of energy by now. We should not be here. I should not be here talking about this. And yet I am. The universe still has usable energy left. How do you explain this except on the hypothesis that the universe had a beginning to its existence? There was a time when the universe had 100% usable energy. Think about it this way. If you walked into a forest and you saw a flashlight lying on the forest floor and it was still shining some light, maybe it was a little dim, but it still had the battery still had some juice left, what would you conclude? That maybe the flashlight had been there a day, maybe 2 days? You certainly wouldn't conclude that the flashlight had been there for 100 years. And you certainly wouldn't conclude that it had been there for an infinite amount of time, that the flashlight had always been there shining light. Because if the flashlight had always been there shining light, it would have run out of energy by the time you discovered it. In fact, it would have run out of usable energy infinitely long ago. Or think about this. If you were to walk into a parking lot and you were to see a car running, somebody had abandoned it and it was just sitting there running, what would your conclusion be? Well, considering that the gas tank has only a finite amount of gasoline in it, you wouldn't conclude that the car had been running from infinite past time, because if it had been running there for infinite past time, it would be out of gas by now and would have stopped running. So your conclusion with both the flashlight and the car is that there was, once upon a time, it had all of its energy. And in fact, somebody had put the energy into the car, into the flashlight, so that it could run. Same thing goes with the universe. If the universe has only a finite amount of energy, and if it's chugging away its energy, if it's losing more and more energy as time goes out, the universe cannot have existed forever. It must have began to exist a finite time ago. If a clock is winding down, there must be a time when it's wound up. There are some philosophical arguments against the infinitude of the past. You see, this argument, the Kalam Cosmological Argument, has been around for centuries. Al-Ghazali, he died in the year 1111. So how in the world did these Christian and Islamic thinkers argue for creation and for a creator if the scientific evidence that I just talked about did not exist back then? Well, they had two different philosophical arguments to argue for the beginning of the universe. Both of them are based on the nature of infinity. In addition to the abundance of scientific evidence for the origin of the universe, there's an argument for the beginning of the universe based on the impossibility of the actual infinite. Al-Ghazali argued that an actually infinite number of things could not possibly exist. Why did he say that? Well, because he said that if an actually infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. For example, let's say that I had an infinite number of CDs, and on each of those infinite CDs, I had an infinite number of songs on them. well, before, okay, wait a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, anyway, let's say I had an infinite number of CDs, and let's say I wanted to give you some. Let's say that I gave you all of the CDs so that there was none left for me. Well, in this case, I would have no CDs left. No CDs left. I had an infinite number of CDs, and then I gave you an infinite number of CDs, all of them, in fact, so I had none left. Infinity minus infinity is 0. But now let's say I wanted to give you all of the CDs that had odd numbers on them. So in this case, you would have all of the CDs that have odd numbers written on them, and I would have all of the CDs that had even numbers written on them. But we would, in this case, we would both have an infinite number of CDs. You would have an infinite number of odd numbered CDs, and I would have an infinite number of even numbered CDs. Infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now let's say I wanted to give you all of the CDs numbered 4 or greater than. In this case, you have an infinite number of CDs, but I only have 3 left. Infinity minus infinity is 3. You see where I'm going with this? In the first case, infinity minus infinity is 0. In the second case, infinity minus infinity is infinity. In the third case, infinity minus infinity is 3. We have subtracted identical quantities from identical quantities, and yet we have arrived at non-identical results. This shows that infinity is just a concept that exists in your mind, not something that could exist in reality. If it did exist in reality, contradictions would result. Contradictory mathematical equations. But it gets even weirder than that. For let's say I only gave you 1 CD, and you listened to all of the music on that CD. Let's say that on every CD I have, there's an infinite number of songs on them. In this scenario, if you listen to all of the songs on 1 CD, you would have listened to just as much music as if you had listened to all of the CDs in my collection. But that seems very counterintuitive. It seems one would think that if you listen to all of my CDs instead of just 1, you would hear more music. Certainly not less, and certainly not the same number of songs. But in this case, you would have listened to an identical number of songs on just that 1 CD as you would have as if you listened to all of them. If an actual infinite could exist, various absurdities like these would result. What this means is that the universe cannot be eternal in the past. Because if the universe is eternal in the past, that means that an actual infinite number of things does exist. Namely, an actually infinite number of past events exists. But if it's impossible for an actual infinite number of any things to exist, and yet a beginningless universe contains an actually infinite number of past events, then it follows that the universe cannot be infinite in the past. It must have had a beginning. By the way, I got a little bit ahead of myself again. I meant to distinguish 2 different kinds of infinites here. I'm talking about, in this argument, actual infinites. This is a number that is greater than any finite number. Any number you can think, any natural number you can think of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 99 trillion, any number you can think of, infinity, actual infinity, is greater than whatever number you're thinking of. Now, a potential infinity, on the other hand, is just a limit that is never reached. For example, as a Christian, I believe that I have eternal life. I'm going to live with Jesus forever in heaven. but I'm not going to spend an actually infinite number of moments in heaven. That is impossible. Infinity is just a limit that I am heading towards that I never actually reach. No matter how long I live in heaven, I will never have an infinitieth birthday. That's never going to happen. That would be an actual infinite. But a potential infinite is just, you keep adding one after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, after another of whatever it is, be it days, months, video games in your collection, whatever it is, you just keep adding one after another, and the collection never stops growing. So that's a potential infinite. Now Al-Ghazali had no problem with this kind of infinite, a potential infinite, striving for infinity but never getting there. What he had a problem with were actual infinites. An actual infinite would be a complete set. If you had, an infinite number of marbles. In an actually infinite number of marbles or CDs or whatever it is you're talking about, it would be impossible to add to that. It would be, because the number of things that you have in your collection would be greater than it would be a number greater than any finite number. Now, a potentially infinite number of CDs or marbles or video games would just be a never-ending collection. It just grows and grows and grows and grows and never stops. So I wanted to get that out of the way, because it's important to define our terms, because I don't want anyone commenting, oh, but infinites can exist, and here's an example of that, and then they would show an example of a potential infinite. I'm not arguing that a potential infinite can't exist. I'm arguing that an actual infinite cannot exist. Okay, one more argument for the finitude of the past. This also relies on the nature of infinity, but this is a different argument than the one I just used. You could, if you think the last argument is a bad one, if you think it's a stinker, you can throw that one out, and you can still use this one, because it's an independent argument from the one I just gave. This one says, okay, let's just pretend that an actually infinite number of things could exist. Nevertheless, you cannot form an actually infinite number of things by adding one member after another. Because no matter how many more members you add to your collection, there's always going to be another member you can add to the collection before you get to an infinitieth number of whatever it is in your collection. This is also known as the impossibility of traversing the infinite. You see, if the universe is beginningless, if it never began to exist, then the number of past events is actually infinite. But if the number of past events is actually infinite, then the present moment could never have arrived, because before today came about, yesterday had to come about. But before yesterday could come about, the day before yesterday had to come about. And before the day before yesterday could come about, the day before yesterday had to come about. And before that day could come about, the day before that day had to come about. And before that day could come about, the day before that day had to come about, and so on, and so on back into infinity. As a result, no day could ever dawn, because an infinite number of days would have to be reached first. No day could ever come about. But if that's the case, then today couldn't have come about. But that's absurd. Obviously, today has come about. We're here in this moment right now. So what this means is that the number of past days cannot just extend forever into the past, but there must have been a starting point somewhere. Let me use another analogy if you're having trouble grasping this. I know that sometimes if you're new to this material, it can be very challenging. if you're familiar with it, you know, it's very easy. But if you've never heard of the Kalam Cosmological Argument before, if you've never heard these arguments against infinity, sometimes it can be a bit of a brain stretcher. I've had plenty of people tell me, you know, you need to slow down and repeat that. Here's another. Here's an illustration to help you see what I mean. Let's say you had an infinite number of dominoes, and and you had the last domino right here, and you just had one domino just extending back and back and back for as far as the eye can see, and it's just it never ends. What that means is, if an actually infinite number of dominoes had to fall in order for this last domino to fall. But in that case, think about this. Before this domino could fall, the domino before it had to fall. Before that domino could fall, the domino before it had to fall. Before that domino could fall, the domino before it had to fall. And before that domino could fall, the domino before that had to fall. And you just go back and back and back. No domino in the lineup, no domino in the line could ever fall, because there would always have to be another domino that would have to fall before it. In fact, an infinite number of dominoes. But that means that this domino, which is my thumb, this domino could never fall. But if you see the last domino in the set fall, what's your conclusion? There had to be a first domino there, and there had to be someone or something, you know, either a person flicking the first domino, or the wind, or a rabbit or something. Some caused the first domino. There was a first domino, and something caused it to fall, which set off those other dominoes to fall, resulting in the last one. In the same way, there must have been a first moment. There must have been a beginning of time. Another illustration. Here's another illustration that I've heard Christian philosophers use, is that of a bottomless coffee cup. A coffee cup that is bottomless, because I don't know, anyone who has a bottomless coffee cup probably has a really, really, really hard time getting up in the morning. If you had a bottomless coffee cup, no matter how much coffee you poured in a cup, you could never fill it up to the top. In order to fill it up to the top, there had to be a bottom to the coffee cup. There had to be a starting point in order for it to start filling up. Well, in the same way, the universe had to have a starting point in order for us to be here today. Here's another way to think about it. As I said earlier, an actual infinite is greater than any finite number. It's greater than any finite number. You cannot add to infinity. You cannot go infinity plus 1. But if the universe is beginningless, we've already endured through an actually infinite past time. Assuming the argument I just gave was invalid for whatever reason, if we were to concede that we have indeed endured through an infinite moment of past events and somehow magically arrived at the present moment, even though it's impossible to traverse the infinite, you cannot add to infinity. You cannot go to infinity plus 1. But guess what we're going to do tomorrow? The sun is going to rise, and we're going to add a new day in the list of past days. Wait a minute. Did we just add to infinity? That's impossible. Did we go infinity plus 1? You know, I don't care what Buzz Lightyear says. It is impossible to go to infinity and beyond. You can't go beyond infinity, Buzz. I'm sorry. Yet that's what's going to happen tomorrow. We're going to add a new day to the number of past days. So that must mean that the number of past events is finite. On the basis of these two philosophical arguments, as well as all of the various scientific evidence for the Big Bang theory and the second law of thermodynamics, we have very good reason to conclude that the universe began to exist. So, we have concluded that whatever begins to exist has a cause. We've concluded that the universe began to exist. From those two premises, it follows logically and inescapably, 3, therefore the universe has a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, the atheist might concede the truth of these two premises. He might say, yes, I agree that anything that comes into being has to have a cause. Something cannot come from nothing. And he might also agree, yes, I think that the scientific evidence for Big Bang cosmology is overwhelmingly strong. I also agree that the second law of thermodynamics implies that the universe had a beginning, since if the universe didn't have a beginning, we'd be out of usable energy by now. He might say, yeah, I agree. These arguments against infinites are very good, and I agree with both premises. I agree that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and the universe has a cause. But why, Evan? Why does the cause have to be God? Why couldn't the cause be some undiscovered law of physics? Why couldn't it be hyperspace? Why couldn't it be something else? I could agree with you that whatever begins to exist, I could agree with you that the universe has a cause, but why does it have to be God? Well, remember at the start of this talk, I said that once we affirm the first two premises and thus the conclusion, that is when we go into the conceptual analysis of what it means to be a cause of the universe. We analyze, okay, what properties would a universe's cause have? And here is where it gets very interesting, because when you do that, simple reason leads you to believe that the universe's cause must have certain properties that paint a portrait that looks very strikingly to God in the Bible. We conclude that the cause must be a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, powerful, supernatural, personal creator of the universe. Now, why does it have to have those properties? Am I just making an assertion? No, the cause must be spaceless, because when the Big Bang happened, space came into existence. The Big Bang was the origin of all matter, energy, even space and time themselves. They came into being at the Big Bang. This means that there was no space prior to the Big Bang. So whatever caused the universe to come into existence had to transcend space. It couldn't be inside of space, because space is what came into being. So if there was no space until the Big Bang happened, if the Big Bang was the origin of space, then whatever caused the Big Bang had to itself not be in space. It had to be a spaceless cause, or non-spatial. You see, when someone builds a house, he cannot be inside of the house if the house doesn't exist until he builds the house. If he builds the house, he transcends the house. Once the house is created, he could walk into the house, but until the house is built, he's outside of the house. Well, the same thing with space. Since space didn't exist until the Big Bang, the cause couldn't be in space. It had to be spaceless or non-spatial. It had to be timeless for the same reason. Even Stephen Hawking will tell you that the Big Bang was the beginning of time. And in fact, the Bible in many places talks about the big, time having a beginning. So, this is where science and scripture agree. Not to mention that the Bible itself mentions that, the universe had a beginning to its existence, but that's a different issue altogether. Even Stephen Hawking and other physicists and astronomers will tell you that the Big Bang was the beginning of time. So whatever caused time to come into being could not itself be in time. It had to transcend time. it had to be immaterial. Why? Well, because we've already concluded that it's a spaceless or non-spatial cause. Because it's non-spatial, it has to be immaterial. Why? Because material objects or physical objects have mass. They occupy physical dimensions. So if there is no space until the Big Bang, if the cause of the universe were material, it wouldn't be able to exist, because physical objects have mass. And because of that, they occupy spatial dimensions. They have volume, they have mass, and so you need space in order for them to exist. This is why you can't fit 50,000 people in a Volkswagen Beetle. There's not enough space for all that volume of matter to fit in. So it has to be an immaterial cause. Because it's a spaceless cause, it must be an immaterial cause. It must be uncaused or uncreated. Why is that? Well, because as we've seen, there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. It must be unimaginably powerful, since it was able to create the universe out of absolutely nothing. It must be supernatural. Why? Because the universe came into being. I think that the universe and nature and the universe, I think that these two terms could very properly be thought of as synonyms. Nature is the universe is nature. You could reword the second premise of the argument to say that nature began to exist. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, nature began to exist, therefore nature has a cause. So whatever caused nature to come into being has to transcend nature, has to be outside of nature. Well, that's the very definition of supernatural. So, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, unimaginably powerful, supernatural, and it must be a personal agent, a personal free agent. Why is that? Well, there are three reasons why I say that the cause of the universe must be a personal free agent. One of the reasons is that if it wasn't, the Big Bang would have happened infinitely long ago, and hence we would have an eternally old universe instead of a 14-billion-year-old universe. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say that you had an eternally existing alarm clock, and that eternally existing alarm clock was set to go off 99 trillion years from its conception. Well, since it has existed from eternity past, how long will the alarm clock have gone off? The answer is an eternity ago, or infinitely long ago. Because even though it was set to go off 99 trillion years from the time it was programmed, since it had always been programmed to go off in 99 trillion years, 99 trillion years would have elapsed infinitely long ago. Or let's say that the alarm clock wasn't set to go off 99 trillion years, but instead it was set off to go off in 99 trillion quadrillion years from its conception. Well, since it had existed from eternity past and was always set to go off from its conception, how long ago will it have gone off? Again, eternally ago, or infinitely long ago. Okay, well, let's say that the clock was set off to go off after an infinite amount of time. How long will it have gone off then? The answer, it never would have gone off. The alarm clock would never go off. What if the alarm clock were set to go off? What if it wasn't set to go off at all? Again, it never would go off. See, this is the problem with a mechanistic agent. With a mechanistic agent, you either have, that is to say, a mechanistic agent that is eternally present. With a mechanistic agent that is eternally present, its cause it's going to either be its effect will be co-eternal with it, or else it will never produce the effect at all. In the case of the alarm clock, the eternally existing alarm clock, the alarm is going to go off infinitely long ago, or it's never going to go off at all. That's the problem with an eternally existing mechanistic agent. This ties into the argument that the cause of the universe must be personal, because if the cause of the universe were a mechanistic agent, the Big Bang either would have happened infinitely long ago, or it wouldn't have happened at all. That is to say, we wouldn't be here. Both of those conclusions contradict the scientific evidence. The universe, well, obviously we're here. The universe is here, and it didn't begin infinitely long. It's not infinitely old. It began to exist only about 13 to 14 billion years ago. So how do we get out of this conclusion? Well, I submit to you that the cause of the universe is not a mechanistic agent at all, but is instead a personal creator. In fact, philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig phrases the argument in another way. This is what he wrote in his book, Reasonable Faith. I've got the quote pulled up here, and I'm going to read it to you. Dr. William Lane Craig writes in his book, Reasonable Faith, he says, "In fact, I think that it can be plausibly argued that the cause of the universe must be a personal creator. For how else could a temporal effect arise from an eternal cause? If the cause were simply a mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions existing from eternity, then why would not the effect also exist from eternity? For example, if the cause of waters being frozen is the temperature being below 0 degrees, then if the temperature were below 0 degrees from eternity, then any water present would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water to just begin to freeze a finite time ago. The only way to have an eternal cause, but a temporal effect, would seem to be if the cause is a personal agent who freely chooses to create the effect in time. Like a man sitting from eternity could freely choose to stand up, and hence you would have a temporal effect arise from an eternally existing cause. So we're not just brought to the first cause of the universe, but to its personal creator." End quote. So we've concluded that the cause of the universe is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, uncaused, supernatural, and is a personal being. That sounds a lot like God to me. But before I start looking into objections to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, I don't know if I have time for that. If you've read my blogs, you know I have a hard time staying brief. But there are two other arguments for the cause of the universe as being personal. One of them is that since the cause is immaterial, we've already concluded that, it's got to be one of two things. Either it's got to be an abstract object, like a musical note or a number or something like that. You know, mathematicians and other philosophers think that numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities exist in this way. If they exist, they're abstract objects. So the cause of the universe is either an abstract object, because these abstract objects are thought to be immaterial things. They're beyond space and time. You don't find them in your sock drawer. It's either that, or it's an unembodied mind, something spirit or a soul. So which of these two possible immaterial entities could the cause of the universe be? Well, I don't think an abstract object is a very good candidate for a cause of the universe, because abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause any effects. The number 7 is causally impotent. Can't do anything. It can't create anything. So since abstract objects are causally impotent, the only other option is to believe that the cause of the universe is an unembodied mind, a spirit, something like a spirit or a soul. I'm not talking about a brain. I'm talking about a consciousness without a body. So that's another reason to think the cause of the universe must be a personal being. A third reason has been given by the physicist John Polkinghorne. Yes, there are physicists who believe in the existence of God. You know, don't let the atheists on the internet fool you into thinking that all the scientists are just these big hardcore atheists. There's actually quite a few of them I've discovered that are theists, and some of them are Christian theists, and John Polkinghorne is one of them. This is the argument he gives for the cause of the universe being a personal free agent. He says there are two different types of causes. I think it's John Polkinghorne who gave this. If I'm wrong, you can correct me in the comments section. Francis Schaeffer, I think, also gave this argument. So I'm not sure who originated it, but I think I heard it from Polkinghorne. He said two things. There are two different types of explanations. There are scientific explanations and there are personal explanations. For example, if I were to walk into the kitchen and I were to see my wife or girlfriend or mother or brother or friend boiling water in a kettle on the stove, I could ask, why is that water on the stove boiling? And they could say, well, the kinetic energy from the flame is conducted by the metal bottom of the kettle, and that causes the water molecules to vibrate more and more violently until finally they're thrown off in the form of steam. That would be a scientific explanation. Now, a personal explanation could be as if they said, well, I put it on because I wanted to make tea or macaroni and cheese or whatever. That would be a personal explanation. Now, Polkinghorne argues that the explanation for the beginning of the universe cannot be a scientific explanation or a naturalistic explanation because there was no nature. Remember, nature began to exist, so there cannot be a naturalistic or a scientific explanation why the universe began to exist. So the only other possibility is a personal explanation. Someone wanted the universe to exist. Someone wanted the universe to exist, and that's why they created it. So for these three reasons, we have very good reason to believe that the cause of the universe is a personal being. A space, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And it must be a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, uncaused, supernatural, personal creator. Now, let's look into a few objections to this argument. Stephen Hawking, whom I mentioned earlier, gives one specific objections to this argument. He says, because there is a law, such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And then he goes on to say there's no need to invoke God to light the blue touch paper to set everything going and so on. And if you saw the movie God's Not Dead, which I thought was an excellent movie, this was the argument that Professor Radisson, played by Kevin Sorbo, he used this argument against Josh Wheaton in the class to try to refute his argument for creation. I think that this is actually a very weak objection to creation for two reasons. Number one, Hawking says because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. But gravity isn't nothing. Gravity is clearly something. Gravity isn't nothing. Gravity is a law of physics. Gravity is the reason our solar system formed after being fine-tuned by coalescing matter, dust, gas, and energy together through other constants and quantities had to be fine-tuned as well. Gravity is what keeps our feet planted on the ground. Gravity is the reason the moon orbits the Earth. This is obviously something, not nothing. Now, what is the definition of nothing? If you remember earlier in this talk, I said that nothing is the absence of anything whatsoever. It is literally no thing. It is no thing. It has zero properties. And if it has no properties, how could it cause anything? Remember all of the reasons I gave for thinking that if something begins to exist, it has to have a cause of some sort. So whatever brought the universe into existence couldn't be nothing, because to say that the universe created itself from nothing is just a different way of saying the universe came into existence without a cause. Things don't pop into being out of nothing. The things only come into being from antecedent causes. So not only is gravity not nothing, but true nothingness is the absence of anything whatsoever, and it has no causal powers. The second reason is not only is gravity not nothing, gravity is a part of the universe. If it's part of the universe, it couldn't possibly bring the universe into being. If the universe came into being and gravity is a part of the universe, then gravity couldn't have brought the universe into being. Instead, gravity came into being with the universe. Stephen Hawking's argument, it's pretty much like saying, to say that the universe created itself out of nothing is sort of like me saying that my belly button gave birth to me. If someone came to you and said, because there is such a thing as the belly button, Evan Minton will inevitably bring himself into being from nothing. If someone said that to you, you would laugh at them. You would see the obvious absurdity of their statement. This statement is just as absurd as Hawking's statement. My navel is a part of me. So if it's a part of me, how could it bring me into existence? It can't. The cause of my existence must be a transcendent cause. That is, a cause or causes that exist wholly apart from my body in order to bring me into existence. Likewise, the cause of the universe's beginning must be a transcendent cause. It must be something or someone that exists apart from the universe. And as we've just seen, we have very good reasons to believe that the universe's cause is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, powerful, supernatural, personal creator. So, it really astonishes me that a man as brilliant as Stephen Hawking, I have very high regards for Hawking. Don't think I'm making fun of him or belittling him. He's a very brilliant man, and it impresses me that he's been able to achieve so much, and he's paralyzed. He can't move. He has to use a machine to talk and, use his eyes in order to tell the machine what to say. I don't think I could live, I don't think I could work at McDonald's in his condition, and yet he somehow managed to do it. So don't think I'm belittling Hawking here, but it is a very weak argument, and the logical mistakes he makes just seems, it seems like they should be obvious. So how in the world could someone like Hawking make such a simple logical error? How anyone with his level of intellect could make a mistake that simple is beyond me. As the mathematician John Lennox said, nonsense is still nonsense, even when it comes out of the mouths of famous scientists. Okay, let's look at another objection to the Kalam cosmological argument. A lot of people, when you give an argument for God's existence, like the one I just gave, and especially if it's a scientific argument or a philosophical / scientific argument, they will accuse you of committing God of the gaps. A God of the gaps argument. Now, what is a God of the gaps argument? A God of the gaps argument is when you punt to God, when you infer God, when you have no explanation. You see a phenomenon and you have no idea how to explain it, and so you just say, God did it. You throw up your hands and you say, God did it. You don't even try to figure it out. And a lot of time throughout history, people have appealed to God or gods to explain things like lightning. Lightning striking and killing someone could be Thor's wrath. Although I've watched the Avengers movie, and he seems like a pretty nice guy. I don't think he would kill anyone just like that, unless they were threatening New York City. But that's basically what a God of the gaps argument is. It's basically another name for an appeal to ignorance. Now, is the argument that I just gave does it commit that kind of fallacy? Am I just saying God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth because I don't know how to explain why the Big Bang happened? That is not the case at all. You see, for one, this is a deductive argument, that, and it is a logically valid argument. As long as the two premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. And I've given very good reasons to believe in the two premises. For example, I said that it's intuitively obvious that things just don't pop into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Pop, 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 pop. Oh, look, a unicorn just appeared in the room. No, I'm just kidding. That doesn't happen. Moreover, if it could happen, why don't we see it happening more often? Thirdly, whenever we do see things coming into being, we don't see them coming into being uncaused out of nothing. Rather, we see some type of cause, whether it be a person, an animal, force of nature, something caused it to happen. Also, I think the fact that the presupposition of this premise has aided scientific progress over the last 500 years is a pretty good indication that we are on solid ground here in affirming that things begin to exist, have a cause. And in fact, if you deny it, if people denied this half a millennia ago, I think we would still be living in the Dark Ages. And I also gave very good evidence for the second premise, that the universe began to exist. I appealed to the various strands of scientific evidence for the Big Bang Theory, the expansion of the universe, the abundance of light elements in the universe, the cosmic microwave background radiation, which, according to some astronomers I've heard speak, is actually greater evidence for the expansion of the for the beginning of the universe than even the expansion is. I've appealed to the second law of thermodynamics and some good philosophical arguments to show that the universe did begin to exist. So this is not on the basis of what I do not know. This is on the basis of what I do know. You see, a God of the gaps argument, a true God of the gaps argument, is on the basis of what you don't know. But I have made an argument for a creator on the basis of what I do know. I do know that things that come into being have a cause. And I do know, based on very powerful scientific evidence and philosophical argumentation, that the universe began to exist. So since I do know those two truths, I do know that the universe has a cause. So I don't think you could accuse me of making an appeal to ignorance on either of the two premises. The two premises are on the basis of what I do know, not on the basis of what I don't know. But maybe it's the conceptual analysis part that throws people off. As I said earlier, an atheist might be willing to concede that those two premises are true. We do know that the universe, we do know whatever begins to exist has a cause for the reasons I gave earlier. We do know the universe began to exist. The Big Bang has a very abundant evidence for it scientifically, and this can be found in any textbook on astronomy you pick up. So maybe the accusation that it's the God of the gaps isn't from the defense of the two premises. Maybe it is the argument's conclusion that ignites that charge. So what about that? Is that on the basis of what I don't know? Well, I have heard some Christians, when they talk about the origin of the universe, they say things like atheists don't know how the universe began. And they do kind of argue that because atheists can't explain it in an atheistic framework, therefore our view must be right. But if you paid close attention to what I was saying, you'll notice that I did not argue that way. I did not argue that the universe's cause must be God because atheists are at a loss at how to explain the Big Bang from their worldview perspective. I argued that the cause of the universe must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, supernatural, and personal. And I gave good reasons. I said, for example, it must be spaceless because there was no space prior to the Big Bang. And if there was no space until the Big Bang happened, whatever caused the universe had to be spaceless. It had to be a spaceless entity because there was no time until the universe began. The cause cannot be bound at time, it must be timeless. I said because the cause is spaceless, it has to be an immaterial entity because material entities have volume and they have mass and they occupy spatial dimensions. They take up space. So if the cause were material, it wouldn't be able to exist because there's no space. But obviously, we do know that a cause for the universe exists because the two premises are true. So if it can't be material and exist, then it must be immaterial. I said it must be uncaused because you can't have an infinite regress of causes. You can't have gods begetting gods, so to speak. It must be unimaginably powerful because it created the universe out of nothing. I mean, how powerful does something have to be able to make something exist without using any pre-existent materials? And I said it must be personal because a mechanistic agent will either, an eternally existing mechanistic agent will either produce its effect infinitely long ago, or it will never produce its effect at all. It's going to be one of those two things. It's either going to produce its effect infinitely long ago, or it's never going to produce its effect. Which means if the cause of the universe were a non-personal agent, then either we would not exist now, or the universe would have begun to exist infinitely long ago. Both of those contradict the scientific evidence. So if the cause of the universe cannot be non-personal, it must be personal. It must be a personal free agent. I also argue that the cause must be a personal agent because we've concluded that it was immaterial. If the cause is immaterial, it can either be two things. It can either be an abstract objects like numbers or unembodied minds. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause any effects. So since the cause of the universe is not an abstract object, it must be an unembodied mind, something like a spirit or a soul. And also, John Polkinghorne and Francis Schaeffer's argument that since nature began to exist, there cannot be a natural or a scientific explanation for why the universe began to exist. It must be it can't be some sort of undiscovered law of physics or particle that's going to explain why the universe sprang into being. Because any law of physics or particle that scientists discover is going to be a part of the universe. But the universe is what came into being. So that particle came into being. So there's no hope of scientists ever discovering a naturalistic explanation for the Big Bang. The only hope the atheists have that I can see for a scientific or naturalistic explanation is to overthrow the Big Bang altogether. But even then, you still have to refute these philosophical arguments against infinites, because these arguments against actual infinites is the reason why Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thinkers thought the universe began to exist even before all the scientific evidence started coming forth. So since the cause can't be a naturalistic or a scientific explanation, it must be a personal explanation. Someone must have wanted the universe to exist. I mean, as you can see, this is not on the basis of what I don't know. I'm not saying, oh, we don't know what caused why did the Big Bang occur? We don't know, so it must be God. That's not how I argued. I gave positive reasons for thinking why I think that a creator is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. I gave evidence for the origin of the universe. I gave evidence for thinking that anything that has an origin, like the universe does, must have a cause. And I gave good positive reasons for thinking why the universe's cause must have the properties that it does. This is not on the basis of what I don't know. This is all on the basis of what I do know. Now, if you want to refute the argument, you've got to show either that one of the premises in the syllogism is false, or else provide a better conceptual analysis, a different conceptual analysis for what the universe's cause might be. Okay, we've been going for a while now, so I think I'm going to wrap this up. One more. This is the most common. This is the most common question that is brought up whenever a theist uses any argument for God's existence, actually creation and design especially. Atheists always bring up this question. They say, okay, if God created the universe, who created God? If God created the universe, who created God? Or as Richard Dawkins likes to phrase it, who designed the designer? Who created the creator? This is actually, this is a question that I asked when I was like 3 years old. I think everyone asks this question at some point in their life, whether they're theist or atheist. The thing is that the first premise of the argument does not say that everything has to have a cause. That is one very common misunderstanding of the premise. It's not that everything that exists has a cause. It's that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. But something that existed forever wouldn't need a cause. Something that has always existed and never began to exist would not need a cause. It wouldn't need a creator. God, or the spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal creator, never began to exist. So the premise doesn't apply to him. Who created God? No one created God. God always existed. Now, in case you think that this is special pleading for God, atheists have typically said that the universe always existed. It has always existed, and therefore didn't need a cause. I mean, atheist scientists, before all the evidence for the Big Bang came about, no one was running around saying, what caused the universe to come into existence? What created the universe? In fact, when theists would ask that question, well, okay, if there's no God, well, then how did the universe come into being? They would say, maybe the universe has always been around. Maybe it doesn't need a creator. Maybe it doesn't need a cause. That's what they would say. They thought the universe was eternal. But that response is now invalid on the basis of very powerful scientific evidence and philosophical arguments, as we've just seen. So if there's nothing logically fallacious about an uncaused universe, there shouldn't be anything fallacious about an uncaused creator. The reason why the universe can't be uncaused, why it can't be uncreated, is because we have very good reasons for thinking it began to exist. And if you're just now joining this podcast, if you don't know what those reasons are, this will be available online on Cerebral Faith and on YouTube and Google+, and you can go back and watch it later and see why I think that the universe began to exist, if you're just now tuning in. Moreover, I think it's more reasonable to think that the universe's creator had to be uncaused or eternally existing. Because of the arguments against infinites that I gave. You see, there can't be an infinite regress of causes. If we concede that God has to have a cause, okay, well, number one, that wouldn't refute the argument that in the beginning God created the heavens and the universe, the heavens and the earth. You wouldn't refute the argument that the universe has a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, supernatural, personal creator. The two premises of the argument would still stand, even if I couldn't answer this question, and so would the conclusion. Who created God could just be left as an open question for later inquiry. But if we were to concede that God does need to have a cause, then what about his creator? What about his heavenly Father? Does his heavenly Father need to have a cause? Does God's God need to have a cause? Well, then what about that God? Does he have to have a cause? What about in other words, if God created the universe, who created God? And if X created God, who created X? Okay, who created the one who created God? Who created the one who created the one who created God? And who created the one who created the one who created the one who created God? Who created the one 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 who created God? You see, we are in this infinite regress of creators begetting creators. It's the same reason why the past cannot be actually infinite. You see, if God needs to have a cause, if there is no uncreated creator, then we just have a lineage, a genealogy of gods begetting gods. But if that's the case, no creator could ever come into existence. But if no creator ever came into existence, then the universe could never have come into existence. And obviously we're here. It makes sense to believe that the creator of the universe it makes more sense to believe that he's uncreated than created. An uncaused cause is far more believable than one that has to have a cause. At the very least, somewhere in that lineage of Yahwehs, there has to be an uncreated Yahweh. Occam's razor would suggest that the first Yahweh is the uncreated one, since all this progression of Yahwehs seems superfluous. Occam's razor is a scientific principle that says that you should not invoke any more agents than what is required to explain the phenomena. Since one uncreated creator is required to explain the Big Bang, we should only infer one uncreated creator, not an uncreated creator back here in a lineage of creators. So, I think that the Kalam Cosmological Argument is a very good argument. There are more objections that could be raised against the argument. If you want to go into this material into more depth and more detail, I do have some resources that you could check out. Number one, you can check out www.cerebralfaith.blogspot.com. That is my blog. You can see it right there underneath my name. I recently created a page that's on a sidebar that says Natural Theology Library. And there I list all of the different articles on all of the different arguments for God's existence. And I categorize them, articles about the Kalam Cosmological Argument, articles about the fine-tuning argument, which we'll be talking about tomorrow night, articles about the moral argument, and so on. If you want to look at more objections that non-theists have brought to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, you can look at that page on Cerebral Faith. You can also check out these books. On Guard by the Christian philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig. He, in chapter, I think it's chapter 3, he has an entire chapter on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. He talks about some of the things that I've been talking about tonight. He also goes into more depth of the Kalam Cosmological Argument in Reasonable Faith. But if you're new to apologetics, if you're new to arguments for God's existence, whether you're a Christian or not, I would suggest you start off with On Guard, because On Guard, William Lane Craig's On Guard is a very entry-level book, while Reasonable Faith is a little more advanced than that. You could also check out Hugh Ross's book, The Creator and the Cosmos, and in the he spends half of the book going into the scientific evidence for the Big Bang Theory. It's a very good book. Hugh Ross is a Christian apologist. He's a pastor, but he's also an astrophysicist. He got his degree in astronomy and astrophysics, and he minored in physics. So this is, he knows what he's talking about in both the realm of science, astronomy, and in theology. So he's got He's an astrophysicist, and he spends half of the book talking about the scientific evidence for the Big Bang theory. You could also check out Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. That's also a good book that you can check out. So if you want to go into this argument in further detail. Well, thank you for tuning in tonight to listen to my discussion on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. I hope you will tune in tomorrow night where I will be giving a second argument for God's existence called the teleological argument, or the fine-tuning argument. It's one of the many arguments for design, and it's my favorite. I think it's the most powerful design argument out there. I will end with a passage from Scripture. Natural theology doesn't depend on Scripture, as we've seen. It argues for God's existence on the basis of science, logic, and reason alone. But I will end this podcast with a passage from Scripture because it relates to what we've been talking to tonight. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Well, signing off. I hope you will join me again tomorrow night for when I give a talk on the fine tuning of the universe.